John Carter was a man who had lived most of his life under the wide, open skies of Texas. He was not one for many words, but his hands told his story, hands roughened by years of pulling ropes, mending fences, and branding cattle. His ranch stretched for miles, with the prairie grass rolling like waves whenever the wind swept across. He had worked hard to build it from almost nothing. When others had doubted him, saying a young man couldn't tame such land, John had pressed on with quiet determination. The ranch thrived now. He had a good herd of cattle, sturdy horses, and men who respected him. In town, people nodded at him with respect, calling him a man of his word. But despite his success, John carried a loneliness that he could not shake. Each night, after long days of work, he would sit by the fire in his cabin, the silence pressing around him. He had no one to share his meals with, no one to laugh at the small happenings of the day, and no gentle voice to break the quiet of the night. As the years passed, he began to feel that his life, though full of hard work, was missing something vital. What good was a ranch if there was no one to build a family with, no one to share it with? That thought weighed on him until he finally decided to do something about it. Mail order rides had become common in those days. Women from the East, often wary of the crowded cities or looking for a better life, would answer advertisements from men in the West. John had thought long and hard before writing his first letter. His words were plain, just as he was plain, but he spoke honestly about who he was and what kind of life he offered. He didn't promise wealth or luxury, only hard work, open skies, and a steady hand to protect and provide. To his surprise, a letter came back from a woman named Clara Miller. She was a schoolteacher from Boston. Clara wrote with neat handwriting and kind words. She told him of her desire for a fresh start, of her longing to leave behind the cold winters and crowded streets. In every letter, she sounded gentle, thoughtful, and patient. John read her words again and again, imagining the voice behind them. As weeks turned into months, their letters became the highlight of his days. While others around him thought of cattle prices and ranch work, John thought of Clara. He imagined her walking across the dusty yard, smiling as she brought light into his simple cabin. She spoke of reading books, of music she loved, and of the children she hoped to teach one day. John found himself smiling at her dreams, though he had never seen her face in person. Finally, the day came when Clara wrote that she was ready to travel west. John felt both excitement and nervousness. He cleaned his cabin carefully, built a new rocking chair for her by hand, and even polished his boots until they shone. For a man who was used to dust and sweat, this was a new kind of preparation, a hope for something beyond cattle and fences. On the morning of her arrival, John rode into town early. The small railway station bustled with activity as wagons rolled in and horses clattered against the wooden street. Families greeted loved ones, children shouted with joy, and merchants unloaded supplies. John stood tall near the platform, his best shirt tucked neatly, his hat held respectfully in his hand. His heart beat with an unfamiliar rhythm, not from fear of work or danger, but from anticipation. The wagon carrying passengers finally rolled in, its wheels creaking as it came to a stop. John's eyes searched eagerly for Clara. He imagined a woman with a soft smile and careful steps, just as her letters had suggested. But as the passengers stepped down, he did not see her face. Instead, another woman appeared. She was tall, with striking eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. Her hair was tied back in a simple braid, and her hands looked as though they had done hard work before. She was not dressed like the gentle schoolteacher he had pictured. Her clothes were plain, practical, and dusty from the road. When her eyes met his, there was no shy smile, only a direct, steady gaze. John frowned slightly, unsure. Before he could ask, the woman stepped forward and introduced herself. "My name is Evelyn Miller," she said firmly. "Clara's sister." The word struck John like a sudden gust of wind. Evelyn? Sister? He had never heard Clara mention her sister in the letters. Confusion filled him as he tried to understand. Evelyn explained quickly. Clara had fallen ill just before the journey. The doctors had advised her not to travel such a long distance, And Clara, not wanting to disappoint John or break the agreement, had asked her younger sister Evelyn to come in her place. Clara had trusted Evelyn to fulfill the promise. John stood in stunned silence. He had imagined Clara's soft voice, her gentle ways, her teacher's smile, but here was Evelyn, with a sharp tongue and bold presence. Nothing like the woman in his letters. The townsfolk who gathered nearby watched with curiosity. Whispers spread. Some shook their heads, wondering if John would turn her away. After all, a man had ordered one bride and received another. It was not what anyone expected. John, however, was a man of few words and steady decisions. Though his mind spun with questions, he did not let them show. He looked at Evelyn again, noticing the strength in her stance, the determination in her eyes. Life on a ranch was hard, and perhaps Clara had known that her sister was better suited for it. "Come with me," John finally said, his voice calm. "The ranch is a few miles from here. You must be tired." Evelyn gave a small nod and followed him to the wagon. Though she did not smile, her posture carried a certain confidence as they rode back to the ranch. Silence stretched between them. John wrestled with his thoughts. Was this what he wanted? Could he build a life with a woman he had never written to, one so different from the person he expected? Yet deep down, he felt something stir. Evelyn might not be Clara, but she carried a strength that the West itself seemed to respect. By the time they reached the ranch, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of red and gold. Evelyn stepped down from the wagon, her boots sinking into the dust of the yard. She looked at the land, the cattle grazing, the fences stretching into the horizon. Instead of fear or hesitation, her eyes held a quiet challenge, as though she were daring the land to test her. John watched her closely. He had expected gentleness, softness, and patience. What he received instead was fire, determination, and strength. Whether this would bring trouble or blessing, only time would tell. And so began a new chapter in John Carter's life, one he had not planned for, but one that promised to be far from ordinary. The first days of Evelyn's life at the ranch were not easy. She had never lived on such wide and open land before, and everything about it seemed larger, louder, and harsher than the city she had left behind. The sun rose earlier, the wind carried dust that clung to her clothes, and the nights were so quiet that even the sound of a coyote in the distance seemed startling. But Evelyn was not a woman who gave up easily. From the first morning, she made it clear that she would not sit idly while John worked. When the rooster crowed, she was already awake. Instead of waiting for breakfast to be served, she took it upon herself to learn how to cook with what was available: eggs, bread, beans, and coffee. She burned the first pan of biscuits, and John quietly pushed them aside, but she only laughed and promised to do better the next time. By the second week, she had managed to cook meals that even the ranch hands nodded at with satisfaction. But it was not in the kitchen that Evelyn showed her true strength. The ranch demanded hard work, and she did not hesitate to roll up her sleeves. She carried buckets of water from the well, her arms straining but never faltering. She mended torn shirts and saddle straps, her fingers quick and clever. When a calf wandered too far from the herd, she surprised John by taking a horse and bringing it back herself, outriding with steady hands and a sharp eye. At first, John found himself frustrated. He had expected Clara's gentleness, her patience, her soft voice reading books by the fire. Evelyn was different, bold, outspoken, and unafraid to argue with him. When he told her not to worry about the cattle, she insisted on helping. When he suggested she rest, she reminded him that she hadn't come all this way just to sit in a rocking chair. The ranch hands, too, were unsure what to make of her. They had been polite when she first arrived, whispering among themselves that the schoolteacher he had sent for had turned into someone entirely different. But when they saw her lift a heavy sack of grain without complaint, or stand in the barn through a storm to keep the horses calm, their whispers turned into respect. She was not afraid of sweat or dirt, and she did not shrink from the kind of tasks most women in town would never even attempt. Slowly, John began to notice things he had not seen before. Evelyn's laughter rang louder than Clara's gentle words, but it filled the cabin with life. Her hands, though rough, worked with determination, and her eyes, sharp, steady, and fearless, reminded him of the very land he lived on. Strong, unyielding, and beautiful in its own way. One evening, a storm rolled in without warning. Dark clouds gathered over the plains, the wind howled, and rain fell in sheets. The cattle panicked, breaking through part of the fence. John saddled his horse and was ready to ride out when he saw Evelyn pulling on a raincoat and grabbing another horse. "You're not coming," he told her firmly. She looked at him, her chin lifted. "You won't be able to handle them all alone." Before he could argue, she was already on the horse, urging it forward. Together they rode into the storm, shouting against the wind, guiding the cattle back into place. Her braid came loose, her clothes were soaked, but she did not falter. When they returned hours later, exhausted but victorious, John could not help but look at her with new eyes. Another time, trouble came in the form of men. A pair of bandits, hearing of John's thriving herd, tried to steal cattle under the cover of night. Evelyn was the one who first noticed the shadows near the barn. Instead of running, she took up the shotgun that hung near the door and stood guard. When John arrived, she was already warning the men off with steady hands and steady words. The bandits left without a fight, muttering curses. But John knew it could have ended far worse if not for her courage. Day by day, something shifted between them. John's heart, once set on Clara's gentle ways, began to recognize Evelyn's fire as something he needed more. He had spent years battling storms, droughts, and long winters. What he needed was not someone fragile, but someone strong enough to stand beside him through it all. Evelyn was that person. The townsfolk who had whispered behind their backs now saw the truth. They watched Evelyn ride into town with confidence, sell eggs and butter at the market, and speak with fairness when others argued. Some women admired her boldness, others frowned at her lack of refinement. But no one could deny that she had become part of the rancher's life. John himself, though slow to admit feelings, could not hide the respect that grew into something deeper. At night, when they sat by the fire, he listened as Evelyn spoke of her dreams. She wanted to see the land flourish, to plant a garden, to perhaps one day raise children who would grow strong, like the ranch itself. Her words were not polished like Clara's letters, but they were filled with sincerity and determination. One evening, after months of working side by side, John finally spoke what was in his heart. "When I sent for Clara, I thought I knew what I needed," he said quietly. "But life has a way of surprising a man. Clara might have been kind and gentle, but it is you, Evelyn, who has shown me what true strength looks like. You've stood beside me in storms, in danger, and in long days of work. I cannot imagine this ranch without you anymore." Evelyn's eyes softened, though she did not look away. "I didn't plan to be here," she admitted. "But sometimes we don't choose the road we take, it chooses us. And I believe I was meant to be here." From that day forward, there was no doubt in anyone's mind. The rancher who had ordered a bride had found a wife in the most unexpected way. Their marriage, born out of chance, became a story of true partnership. John no longer sat alone by the fire. Evelyn's laughter filled the cabin. Her presence filled the ranch. And together they faced whatever challenges came their way in the end. John understood the truth. Life does not always give the person you expect, but often it gives the person you truly need. And for him, that person was Evelyn Miller, the sister who stepped off the wagon in her place, but who stepped into his life as if she had always belonged there.